The world arrived in Johannesburg expecting another predictable G20 summit. The same power blocks, the same U.S. dominance, the same diplomatic theatrics. But instead, something entirely different happened. One empty chair turned the entire global order upside down. The United States didn't show up. No speeches, no handshakes, no influence, no presence at all. And that sudden void didn't just create confusion, it created an opportunity. One so massive, so unexpected, that it shifted global attention toward a country nobody predicted would step into the spotlight so confidently. Canada. Inside the halls of the summit, leaders whispered, analysts scrambled, markets tensed. Because in the absence of Washington's shadow, one man walked in with a calmness that felt almost surgical. A man who had already laid the groundwork days before anyone even realized it. Mark Carney. But what he did next, and what followed in the next 24 hours, will be studied by economists and diplomats for years. Because this wasn't simply a summit anymore. This was a test. A moment that would quietly rewrite how the world sees power, partnership, and leadership. And Canada was ready. The entire world expected Donald Trump to attend the G20. He was, after all, the leader of the world's largest economy, the country that typically overshadows every conversation. But then came the announcement that sent the summit reeling. Trump refused to go. He openly declared he wouldn't participate, wouldn't represent his country, and wouldn't sit at the table with leaders from 2/3 of the planet's population. His reason? A volatile mix of political fury, misinformation, and public accusations that South Africa shouldn't be hosting the summit at all. Almost instantly, diplomatic circles froze. The U.S. chair, usually the busiest seat in the entire room, would remain empty, completely empty. For other countries, this was more than surprising. It was destabilizing. Global markets depend on predictability, and the sudden disappearance of America's presence introduced the opposite: uncertainty, vulnerability, and a gap no one expected. But in that confusion, in that moment of shifting gravity, a door quietly opened, and someone was already walking through it. Because the absence of one power does not create silence. It creates space, and someone always steps in. Next up, the entrance of a different kind of leader. Hours after Trump's boycott ignited global chatter, another aircraft landed quietly on the Johannesburg runway. There were no theatrics, no dramatic announcements, just a calm, almost deliberate arrival. Mark Carney stepped out. Reporters surged forward immediately. Was Canada ready to operate without America? Would the summit lose direction? Was Carney stepping into a diplomatic disaster? But he didn't entertain the chaos. He didn't posture. He didn't flinch. Carney walked into the summit with a steady composure that contrasted sharply with the global turmoil swirling around him. Inside Canada, this moment carried years of weight. Canadians had long watched their country operate under the gravitational pull of U.S. policy. When Washington shifted, Canada swayed. When America hesitated, Canada paused. But things had changed. The U.S. had become unpredictable, and Canadians were tired of depending on someone they couldn't rely on. Carney stepped into Johannesburg with that frustration in mind, and with a mission already set. A mission few people realized had begun days earlier, because before the summit even started, a move had already been made. While most leaders were still preparing talking points for the summit, Carney was already somewhere else, in the United Arab Emirates. No cameras, no public speeches, just high-stakes, behind-closed-doors negotiations with some of the most powerful investment authorities in the Gulf. These meetings weren't casual. They were intense, precise, calculated. Carney laid out a bold pitch. Canada as the world's next safe, stable, long-term investment haven. a sanctuary in a global era defined by volatility and political unpredictability. And then, the shock came. The UAE committed more than $90 billion to Canada, not in vague promises, but in concrete commitments. Infrastructure, clean energy, technology, development, with $23 billion earmarked specifically for high-priority national initiatives. Global analysts reacted instantly. Markets shifted. Commentators scrambled to understand how Canada secured one of the largest foreign investment deals in years, especially at a moment when the U.S. had stepped back from the global conversation. And Carney? He boarded his flight to Johannesburg not as a spectator, but as a man carrying momentum. The world just didn't know it yet. The first day of the G20 felt different. Not tense, just quieter, more focused. Without Washington setting the tone or dominating the agenda, leaders found themselves listening more closely to voices they often overlooked, and Canada was one of them. Carney's schedule exploded. Meetings with France, the European Union, Germany, the United Kingdom, Norway, all packed into a single day. Diplomats noticed something unusual. World leaders were giving Canada more time, not out of courtesy, but out of necessity. Someone had to speak for stability. And Carney's argument resonated loudly. In an unpredictable world, certainty matters. Reliable supply chains matter. Diversified partnerships matter. Calm leadership matters. Canada, he argued, could offer all four. This wasn't loud diplomacy. It wasn't showmanship. It wasn't about replacing anyone. It was about filling a vacuum with strategy, clarity, and timing. And Carney was playing the long game. Next, the biggest meeting of the entire summit. On Sunday morning, behind closed doors, Carney stepped into a bilateral meeting with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a leader whose decisions influence more than 1 billion people. This was not just another meeting. This was a geopolitical turning point. India is expanding at breakneck speed. New manufacturing hubs, new supply chains, new energy grids, new tech corridors. India needs long-term partners who can be stable, resource-rich, and globally connected. Canada fits that description perfectly. And Canada, on the other hand, needs access to markets that are growing faster than any in the Western world. The meeting ran longer than expected. Aides exchanged notes. News outlets began speculating. When both leaders emerged, analysts could sense something had shifted, not in posture but in expression. Diplomatic sources confirmed that the two nations had agreed to explore new frameworks across multiple sectors. Rumors, still unverified, suggest conversations included critical minerals, clean energy pipelines, tech cooperation, student mobility, defense, manufacturing supply chain realignment. Nothing concrete had been signed, but something far more important had happened: momentum. Canada was no longer reacting to global change, it was shaping it. As the summit drew to a close, a startling realization spread across the diplomatic circles. Canada had become a central voice at a table it usually approached cautiously. And it didn't happen through confrontation. It happened through presence. With America absent, the world didn't fall apart. It simply shifted. Conversations became less combative. Negotiations became more balanced. Smaller nations had more room. Canada had more influence. This G20 wasn't defined by who dominated it. It was defined by who showed up. Carney's diplomacy had turned a geopolitical vacuum into an opportunity, and the international community noticed. Canada wasn't trying to replace the U.S. It wasn't trying to outshine anyone. It simply proved something the world often forgets. Leadership isn't always loud. Sometimes, leadership is calm. And in an era of chaos, calm becomes power. What happened at the G20 wasn't a symbolic victory or a lucky coincidence. It was the beginning of a structural shift in how Canada engages with the world. and how the world sees Canada in return. For decades, Canadian strategy was shaped by proximity. Washington took the lead, and Ottawa followed. That pattern was so familiar, so deeply embedded, that most people never imagined it could change. But this summit proved something different. When a global power steps back, the vacuum doesn't wait. It gets filled instantly by whoever is prepared. And Canada, for the first time in a generation, arrived prepared. The $90 billion UAE commitment wasn't simply foreign investment. It was a declaration that global capital now sees Canada as a safety zone in a world defined by volatility. The extended meeting with India wasn't just a diplomatic courtesy. It hinted at a long-term partnership that could transform Canada's access to future markets, energy corridors, technology exchange, and supply chains. And the sudden attention from Europe wasn't politeness. It was recognition that stable leadership is becoming rare, and Canada is proving it can offer exactly that. This doesn't mean Canada is replacing the United States. It doesn't mean alliances are dissolving or old partnerships are fading. Instead, it means Canada now has leverage, real, measurable leverage built on credibility, consistency, and timing. The country is no longer waiting to see what direction global powers move. It's charting its own course. For Canadians, this shift comes with a quiet but powerful realization. Influence doesn't always come from size or force. Sometimes it comes from reliability. Sometimes it comes from calm. And sometimes it emerges when a country simply chooses to step forward instead of waiting for permission. The G20 proved Canada is no longer playing catch-up. It's stepping into its own moment. When the dust settled in Johannesburg, something remarkable became clear. History didn't shift because of a dramatic confrontation or a loud declaration. It shifted because one of the world's biggest powers suddenly stepped away, and another stepped forward with quiet confidence. The G20 wasn't remembered for the empty chair. It was remembered for how the rest of the world responded to it. For once, Canada wasn't overshadowed by the gravitational pull of American politics. It wasn't waiting for signals from Washington or adjusting to someone else's priorities. It walked into the summit carrying its own agenda, its own alliances, and its own momentum. The UAE investment, the EU outreach, the India breakthrough. The pieces came together like the start of a new geopolitical map, one where Canada wasn't simply reacting to events, but actively shaping them. Carney's approach didn't rely on theatrics or confrontation. It relied on timing. It relied on preparation. It relied on the understanding that in a world full of uncertainty, the calmest voice often becomes the strongest one. And when he told reporters that Canada was ready for what comes next, it didn't sound like a slogan. It sounded like a warning to anyone who underestimated Canada, and a reassurance to anyone who hoped the global stage still had room for steady leadership. Because this summit wasn't just a diplomatic event. It was a reminder that influence can appear suddenly, quietly, and from places the world least expects. The global order is changing, slowly, unpredictably, but unmistakably. And as it shifts, the countries that succeed won't be the loudest ones, but the ones that know when to move. Canada moved, and now the world is watching.